Hey comrades, so this is part 2 out of 3 of chapter 3 of the Wretched of the Earth. The leader pacifies the people. For years on end after independence has been won, we see him, incapable of urging on the people to a concrete task, unable really to open the future to them, or of flinging them into a path of national reconstruction. That is to say, of their own reconstruction. We can see him reassessing the history of independence and recalling the sacred unity of the struggle for liberation. The leader, because he refuses to break up the national bourgeoisie, asks the people to fall back into the past and to become drunk on the remembrance of the epoch which led up to the independence. The leader, seen objectively, brings the people to a halt and persists in either expelling them from history or preventing them from taking root in it. During the struggle for liberation, the leader awakened the people and promised them a forward march, heroic and unmitigated. Today, he uses every means to put them to sleep, and 3 or 4 times a year asks them to remember the colonial period and look back on the long way they have come since then. Now it must be said that the masses show themselves totally incapable of appreciating the long way they have come. The peasant, who goes on scratching out a living from the soil, and the unemployed man who never finds employment, do not manage, in spite of the public holidays and flags, new and brightly colored though they may be, to convince themselves that anything has really changed in their lives. The bourgeoisie, who are in power, vainly increase the number of possessions. The masses have no illusions. They are hungry. And the police officers, though they are now Africans, do not serve to reassure them particularly. The masses begin to sulk. They turn away from this nation in which they have been given no place and begin to lose interest in it. From time to time, however, the leader makes an effort. He speaks on the radio or makes a tour of the country to pacify the people, to calm them and bemuse them. The leader is all the more necessary in that there is no party. During the period of the struggle for independence, there was one right enough, a party led by the present leader. But since then, this party is sadly disintegrated. Nothing is left but the shell of a party, the name, the emblem, and the motto. The living party, which ought to make possible the free exchange of ideas which have been elaborated according to the real needs of the mass of the people, has been transformed into a trade union of individual interests. Since the proclamation of independence, the party no longer helps the people to set out its demands, to become more aware of its needs, and better able to establish its power. Today, the party's mission is to deliver to the people the instructions which issue from the summit. There no longer exists the fruitful give and take from the bottom and top, and from the top to the bottom, which creates and guarantees democracy in a party. Quite on the contrary, the party has made itself into a screen between the masses and the leaders. There is no longer any party life for the branches, which were set up during the colonial period and today are completely demobilized. The militant champs on his bit. Now it is that the attitude taken up by certain militants during the struggle for liberation is seen to be justified, for the fact is that in the thick of the fight, more than a few militants asked the leaders to formulate a dogma, to set out their objectives, and to draw up a program. But under the pretext of safeguarding national unity, the leaders categorically refused to attempt such a task. The only worthwhile dogma, it was repeatedly stated, is the union of the nation against colonialism. And on they went, armed with an impetuous slogan which stood for principles, while their only ideological activity took the form of a series of variants on the theme of the right of the peoples to self-determination, borne on the wind of history which would inevitably sweep away colonialism. When the militants asked whether the wind of history couldn't be a little more clearly analyzed, the leaders gave them instead hope and trust, the necessity of decolonization and its inevitability, and more to that effect. After independence, the party sinks into an extraordinary lethargy. The militants are only called upon when so-called popular manifestations are afoot, or international conferences or independence celebrations. The local party leaders are given administrative posts. The party becomes an administration, and the militants disappear into the crowd and take the empty title of citizen. Now that they have fulfilled their historical mission of leading the bourgeoisie to power, they are firmly invited to retire, so that the bourgeoisie may carry out its mission in peace and quiet. But we have seen that the national bourgeoisie of underdeveloped countries is incapable of carrying out any mission whatever. After a few years, the breakup of the party becomes obvious, and any observer, even the most superficial, can notice that the party, today the skeleton of its former self, only serves to immobilize the people. The party, which during the battle had drawn to itself the whole nation, is falling to pieces. The intellectuals who on the eve of independence rallied to the party now make it clear by their attitude that they gave their support with no other end in view than to secure the slices of the cake of independence. The party is becoming a means of a private advancement. There exists inside the new regime, however, an inequality in the acquisition of wealth and in monopolization. Some have a double source of income and demonstrate that they are specialized in opportunism. Privileges multiply and corruption triumphs, while morality declines. Today the vultures are too numerous and too voracious in proportion to the lean spoils of the national wealth. The party, a true instrument of power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, reinforces the machine and ensures that the people are hemmed in and immobilized. The party helps the government to hold the people down. It becomes more and more clearly anti-democratic, an implement of coercion. The party is objectively, and sometimes subjectively, the accomplice of the merchant bourgeoisie, in the same way that the national bourgeoisie conjures away its phase of construction in order to throw itself into the enjoyment of its wealth. In parallel fashion, in the institutional sphere, it jumps the parliamentary phase and chooses a dictatorship of the National Socialist type. We know today that this fascism at high interest, which has triumphed for half a century in Latin America, is the dialectic result of states which were semi-colonial during the period of independence. In these poor, underdeveloped countries, where the rule is that the greatest wealth is surrounded by the greatest poverty, the army and the police constitute the pillars of the regime. An army and a police force, another rule which must not be forgotten, which are advised by foreign experts. The strength of the police force and the power of the army are proportionate to the stagnation in which the rest of the nation is sunk. By dint of yearly loans, concessions are snatched up by foreigners, scandals are numerous, ministers grow rich, their wives doll themselves up, the members of parliament feather their nests, and there is not a soul down to the simple policeman or the customs officer who does not join in the great procession of corruption. The opposition becomes more aggressive, and the people at once catch on to its propaganda. From now on, the hostility to the bourgeoisie is plainly visible. This young bourgeoisie, which appears to be afflicted with precocious senility, takes no heed of the advice showered upon it, and reveals itself incapable of understanding that it would be in its interest to draw a veil, even if the flimsiest kind, over its exploitation. It is the most Christian newspaper, the African Weekly, published in Brazzaville, which addresses the princes of the regimes thus, quote, "You who are in good positions, you and your wives, today you enjoy many comforts, perhaps a good education, a fine house, good contacts, and many missions on which you are delegated, which open new horizons to you. But all your wealth forms a hard shell which prevents your seeing the poverty that surrounds you. Take care." End quote. This warning, coming from the African Weekly and addressed to the henchmen of Monsieur Youlou, has, we may imagine, nothing revolutionary about it. What the African Weekly wants to point out to the starvers of the Congolese people is that God will punish their conduct. It continues, quote, "If there is no room in your heart for the consideration towards those who are beneath you, there will be no room for you in God's house." End quote. It is clear that the national bourgeoisie hardly worries at all about such an indictment. With its wavelengths tuned in to Europe, it continues firmly and resolutely to make the most of the situation. The enormous profits which it derives from the exploitation of the people are exported to foreign countries. The young national bourgeoisie is often more suspicious of the regime that it has set up than are the foreign companies. The national bourgeoisie refuses to invest in its own country and behaves toward the state that protects and nurtures it with, it must be remarked, astonishing ingratitude. It acquires foreign securities in the European markets and goes off to spend the weekend in Paris or Hamburg. The behavior of the national bourgeoisie of certain undeveloped countries is reminiscent of the members of a gang, who after every hold-up hide their share in the loot from the other members who are their accomplices and prudently start thinking about their retirement. Such behavior shows that more or less consciously the national bourgeoisie is playing to lose if the game goes on too long. They guess that the present situation will not last indefinitely, but they intend to make the most of it. Such exploitation and such contempt for the state, however, inevitably gives rise to discontent among the mass of the people. It is in these conditions that the regime becomes harsher. In the absence of a parliament, it is the army that becomes the arbiter, but sooner or later it will realize its power and will hold over the government's head the threat of a manifesto. As we see it, the national bourgeoisie of certain underdeveloped countries has learned nothing from books. If they had looked closer at the Latin American countries, they doubtless would have recognized the dangers which threaten them. We may thus conclude that this bourgeoisie in miniature that thrusts itself into the forefront is condemned to mark time, accomplishing nothing. In underdeveloped countries, the bourgeois phase is impossibly arid. Certainly, there is a police dictatorship and a profiteering caste, but the construction of an elaborate bourgeois society seems to be condemned to failure. The ranks of decked-out profiteers whose grasping hands scrape up the banknotes from a poverty-stricken country will sooner or later be men of straw in the hands of the army, cleverly handled by foreign experts. In this way, the former mother country practices indirect government, both by the bourgeoisie that it upholds and also by the national army led by its experts, an army that pins the people down, immobilizing and terrorizing them. The observations that we have been able to make about the national bourgeoisie brings us to a conclusion which should cause no surprise. In underdeveloped countries, the bourgeoisie should not be allowed to find the conditions necessary for its existence and its growth. In other words, the combined effort of the masses led by a party of intellectuals who are highly conscious and armed with revolutionary principles ought to bar the way to this useless and harmful middle class. The theoretical question that for the last 50 years has been raised whenever the history of underdeveloped countries is under discussion, whether or not the bourgeois phase can be skipped, ought to be answered in the field of revolutionary action, and not by logic. The bourgeois phase in underdeveloped countries can only justify itself insofar as the national bourgeoisie has sufficient economic and technical strength to build up a bourgeois society, to create the conditions necessary for the development of a large-scale proletariat, to mechanize agriculture, and finally to make possible the existence of an authentic national culture. A bourgeoisie similar to that which developed in Europe is able to elaborate an ideology and at the same time strengthen its own power. Such a bourgeoisie, dynamic, educated, and secular, has fully succeeded in its undertaking of the accumulation of capital and has given to the nation a minimum of prosperity. In underdeveloped countries, we have seen that no true bourgeoisie exists. There is only a sort of little greedy caste, avid and voracious, with the mind of a husker, only too glad to accept the dividends that the former colonial power hands to it. This get-rich-quick middle class shows itself incapable of great ideas or of inventiveness. It remembers what it has read in European textbooks, and imperceptibly it becomes not even the replica of Europe, but the caricature. The struggle against the bourgeoisie of underdeveloped countries is far from being a theoretical one. It is not concerned with making out its condemnation as laid down by the judgment of history. The national bourgeoisie of underdeveloped countries must not be opposed because it threatens to slow down the total harmonious development of the nation. It must simply be opposed because literally it is good for nothing. This bourgeoisie, expressing its mediocrity in its profits, its achievements, and in its thought, tries to hide this mediocrity by buildings which have prestige value at the individual level, by chromium plating on big American cars, by holidays on the Riviera, and weekends in neon-lit clubs. This bourgeoisie, which turns its back more and more on the people as a whole, does not even succeed in extracting spectacular concessions from the West, such as investments which would be of value for the country's economy or setting up of certain industries. On the contrary, assembly plants spring up and consecrate the type of neo-colonialist industrialization in which the country's economy flounders. Thus, it must not be said that the national bourgeoisie retards the country's evolution, that it makes it lose time, or that it threatens to lead the nation up blind alleys. In fact, the bourgeois phase in the history of underdeveloped countries is a completely useless phase. When this caste has vanished, devoured by its own contradictions, it will be seen that nothing new has happened since independence was proclaimed, and that everything must be started again from scratch. The changeover will not take place at the level of the structure set up by the bourgeoisie during its reign, since that caste has done nothing more than take over unchanged the legacy of the economy, the thought, and the institutions left by colonists. It is all the easier to neutralize this bourgeois class in that, as we have seen, it is numerically, intellectually, and economically weak. In the colonized territories, the bourgeois caste draws its strength after independence chiefly from agreements reached with the former colonial power. The national bourgeoisie has all the more opportunity to take over the oppressor since it has been given time for leisurely tete-a-tete with the ex-colonial power. But deep-rooted contradictions undermine the ranks of that bourgeoisie. It is this that gives the observer an impression of instability. There is not as yet a homogeneity of caste. Many intellectuals, for example, condemn this regime based on the domination of the few. In underdeveloped countries, there are certain members of the elite intellectuals and civil servants who are sincere, who feel the necessity for a planned economy, the outlawing of profiteers, and the strict prohibition of attempts at mystification. In addition, such men fight in certain measure for the mass participation of the people in the ordering of public affairs. In those underdeveloped countries which accede to independence, there almost always exists a small number of honest intellectuals who have no very precise ideas about politics, but who instinctively destruct the race for positions and pensions, which is symptomatic of the early days of independence in colonized countries. The personal situation of these men, breadwinners of large families, or their background, hard struggles, and a strictly moral upbringing, explains their manifest contempt for the profiteers and schemers. We must know how to use these men in the decisive battle that we mean to engage upon, which will lead to a healthier outlook for the nation. Closing the road to the national bourgeoisie is, certainly, the means whereby the vicissitudes of new-found independence may be avoided, and with them the decline of morals, the installing of corruption within the country, economic regression, and the immediate disaster of an anti-democratic regime depending on force and intimidation. But it is also the only means towards progress. What holds up the taking of a decision by the profoundly democratic elements of the young nation and adds to their timidity is the apparent strength of the bourgeoisie. In the newly independent, underdeveloped countries, the whole of the ruling class swarms into the towns built by colonialism. The absence of any analysis of the total population induces onlookers to think that there exists a powerful and perfectly organized bourgeoisie. In fact, we know today that the bourgeoisie in underdeveloped countries is non-existent. What creates a bourgeoisie is not the bourgeois spirit, nor its taste or manners, nor even its aspirations. The bourgeoisie is above all the direct product of precise economic conditions. Now, in the colonies, the economic conditions are conditions of a foreign bourgeoisie. Through its agents, it is the bourgeoisie of the mother country that we find present in the colonial towns. The bourgeoisie in these colonies is, before independence, a Western bourgeoisie, a true branch of the bourgeoisie of the mother country that derives its legitimacy, its force, and its stability from the bourgeoisie of the homeland. During the period of unrest that precedes independence, certain native elements, intellectuals, and traders who live in the midst of that imported bourgeoisie try to identify themselves with it. A permanent wish for identification with the bourgeois representatives of the mother country is to be found among the native intellectuals and merchants. This native bourgeoisie, which has adopted unreservedly and with enthusiasm the ways of thinking characteristic of the mother country, which has become wonderfully detached from its own thought and has based its consciousness upon foundations which are typically foreign, will realize, with its mouth watering, that it lacks something essential to a bourgeoisie: money. The bourgeoisie of an underdeveloped country is a bourgeoisie in spirit only. It is not its economic strength, nor the dynamism of its leaders, nor the breadth of its ideas that ensures its peculiar quality as a bourgeoisie. Consequently, it remains at the beginning, and for a long time afterward, a bourgeoisie of the civil service. It is the positions that it holds in the new national administration which will give it strength and serenity. If the government gives it enough time and opportunity, this bourgeoisie will manage to put away enough money to stiffen its domination, but it will always reveal itself as incapable of giving birth to an authentic bourgeois society, with all the economic industrial consequences which this entails. From the beginning, the national bourgeoisie directs its efforts toward activities of the intermediary type. The basis of its strength is found in its aptitude for trade and small business enterprises, and in securing commissions. It is not its money that works, but its business acumen. It does not go for investments, and cannot achieve that accumulation of capital necessary to the birth and blossoming of an authentic bourgeoisie. At the rate it would take centuries to set foot on an embryonic industrial revolution, and in any case it would find the way barred by the relentless opposition of the former mother country, which will have taken all precautions when setting up a neo-colonialist trade conventions. If the government wants to bring the country out of its stagnation and set it well on the road toward development and progress, it must first and foremost nationalize the middleman's trading sector. The bourgeoisie, who wish to see both the triumph of the spirit of money-making and the enjoyment of consumer goods, and at the same time the triumph of their impetuous attitude towards the mass of the people and the scandalous aspect of profit-making, should not we rather call it robbery? In fact, invest largely in this sector. The intermediary market, which formerly was dominated by the settlers, will be invaded by the young national bourgeoisie. In a colonial economy, the intermediary sector is by far the most important. If you want to progress, you must decide in the first few hours to nationalize this sector. But it is clear that such nationalization ought not to take on a rigidly state-controlled aspect. It is not a question of placing at the head of these services citizens who had no political education. Every time such a procedure has been adopted, it has been seen that the government has, in fact, contributed to the triumph of a dictatorship of civil servants who had been set in the mold of the former mother country, and who quickly showed themselves incapable of thinking in terms of the nation as a whole. These civil servants very soon begin to sabotage the national economy and to throw its structure out of joint. Under them, corruption, prevarication, the diversion of stocks, and the black market came to stay. Nationalizing the intermediary sector means organizing wholesale and retail cooperatives on a democratic basis. It also means decentralizing these cooperatives by getting the mass of the people interested in the ordering of public affairs. You will not be able to do all this unless you give the people some political education. Previously, it was realized that this key problem should be clarified once and for all. Today it is true that the principle of the political education of the mass is generally subscribed to in underdeveloped countries, but it does not seem that this primordial task is really taken to heart. When people stress the need to educate the people politically, they decide to point out at the same time that they want to be supported by the people in the action that they are taking. A government which declares that it wishes to educate the people politically thus expresses its desire to govern the people and for the people. It ought not to speak a language destined to camouflage a bourgeois administration. In the capitalist countries, the bourgeois governments have long since left this infantile stage of authority behind. To put it bluntly, they govern with the help of their laws, their economic strength, and their police. Now that their power is firmly established, they no longer need to lose time in shrinking demagogic attitudes. They govern in their own interests, and they have the courage of their own strength. They have created legitimacy, and they are strong in their own right. The bourgeois caste in newly independent countries has not yet the cynicism nor the unruffled calm which is founded on the strength of long-established bourgeoisies. From this springs the fact that it shows a certain anxiety to hide its real convictions, to sidetrack in its short, to set itself up as a popular force. But the inclusion of the masses in politics does not consist in mobilizing 3 or 4 times a year 10,000 or 100,000 men and women. These mass meetings and spectacular gatherings are akin to the old tactics that date from before independence, whereby you exiled your forces in order to prove yourself and to others that you had the people behind you. The political education of these masses proposes not to treat the masses as children, but to make adults of them. This brings us to consider the role of the political party in an underdeveloped country. We have seen in the preceding pages that very often simple souls, who moreover belong to the newly born bourgeoisie, never stop repeating that in an underdeveloped country the direction of affairs by a strong authority, in other words, a dictatorship, is a necessity. With this in view, the party is given the task of supervising the masses. The party plays understudy to the administration and the police, and controls the masses, not in order to make sure that they really participate in the business of governing the nation, but in order to remind them constantly that the government expects from them obedience and discipline. That famous dictatorship, whose supporters believe that it is called for by the historical process and consider it an indispensable prelude to the dawn of independence, in fact symbolizes the decision of the bourgeois caste to govern the underdeveloped country, first with the help of the people, but soon against them. The progressive transformation of the party into an information service is the indication that the government holds itself more and more on the defensive. The incoherent mass of the people is seen as a blind force that must continually be held in check either by mystification or by the fear inspired by the police force. The party acts as a barometer and as an information service. The militant is turned into an informer. He is entrusted with the punitive expeditions against the villages. The embryo opposition parties are liquidated by beatings and stonings. The opposition candidates see their houses set on fire. The police increase their provocations. In these conditions, you may be sure the party is unchallenged, and 99.99% of the votes are cast for the government candidate. We should add that in Africa, a certain number of governments actually behave in this way. All the opposition parties, which moreover are usually progressive and would therefore tend to work for the greater influence of the masses in conduct of public matters, and who desire that the proud money-making bourgeoisie should be brought to heel, have been dint of baton charges and prison condemned first to silence and then to a clandestine existence. The political party in many parts of Africa which are today independent is puffed up in a most dangerous way. In the presence of a member of the party, the people are silent, behave like a flock of sheep, and publish panegyrics in praise of the government or the leader. But in the street, when the evening comes, away from the village, in the cafes or by the river, the bitter disappointment of the people, their despair, but also their unceasing anger, makes itself heard. The party, instead of welcoming the expression of popular discontent, instead of taking for its fundamental purpose the free flow of ideas from the people to the government, forms a screen and forbids such ideas. The party leaders behave like common sergeant majors, frequently reminding the people of the need for quote-unquote silence in the ranks. This party, which used to call itself the servant of the people, which used to claim that it worked for the full expression of the people's will, as soon as the colonial power puts the country into its control, hastens to send the people back into their caves. As far as national unity is concerned, the party will also make many mistakes, as, for example, when the so-called national party behaves as a party based on ethnic differences. It becomes, in fact, the tribe which makes itself into a party. This party, which of its own will proclaims that it is a national party, and which claims to speak in the name of the totality of the people, secretly, sometimes even openly, organizes an authentic ethnic dictatorship. We no longer see the rise of a bourgeois dictatorship, but a tribal dictatorship. The ministers and the members of the cabinet, the ambassadors, and local commissioners are chosen from the same ethnological group as the leader, sometimes directly from his own family. Such regimes of the family sort of seem to go back to the old laws of inbreeding, and not anger but shame is felt when we are faced with such stupidity, such an impostor, such intellectual and spiritual poverty. These heads of the government are the true traitors in Africa, for they sell their country to the most terrifying of all its enemies, stupidity. This tribalizing of the central authority, it is certain, encourages regionalist ideas and separatism. All the decentralizing tendencies spring up again in triumph, and the nation falls into pieces, broken in bits. The leader who once used to call for quote-unquote African unity and who thought of his own little family wakes up one day to find himself saddled with 5 tribes who also want to have their own ambassadors and ministers, and irresponsible as ever, still unaware, still despicable, he denounces their quote-unquote treason. We have more than once drawn attention to the baleful influence frequently wielded by the leader. This is due to the fact that the party in certain districts is organized like a gang, with the toughest person at its head. The ascendancy of such a leader and his power over the others is often mentioned, and people have no hesitation in declaring, in a tone of slightly admiring complacency, that he strikes terror in his nearest collaborators. In order to avoid these many pitfalls, an unceasing battle must be waged, a battle to prevent the party from ever becoming a willing tool in the hands of the leader. Quote-unquote leader. The word comes from the English verb to lead, but a frequent French translation is to drive. The driver, the shepherd of the people, no longer exists today. The people are no longer a herd. They do not need to be driven. If the leader drives me on, I want him to realize that at the same time I show him the way. The nation ought not to be something bossed by a grand panderum. We may understand the panic caused in government circles each time one of these leaders falls ill. They are obsessed by the question of who is to succeed him. What will happen to the country if the leader disappears? The ruling classes who have abdicated in favor of the leader, irresponsible, oblivious of everything, and essentially preoccupied with the pleasures of their everyday life, their cocktail parties, their journeys paid for by government money, the profits they can make out of various schemes, from time to time these people discover the spiritual wasteland at the heart of the nation. A country that really wishes to answer the questions that history puts to it, that want to develop not only its towns, but also the brains of its inhabitants. Such a country must possess a trustworthy political party. The party is not a tool in the hands of the government. Quite on the contrary, the party is a tool in the hands of the people. It is they who decide on the policy that the government carries out. The party is not, and ought never to be, the only political bureau where all members of the government and chief dignitaries of the regime may meet freely together. Only too frequently the political bureau, unfortunately, consists of all the party and its members who reside permanently in the capital. In an underdeveloped country, the leading members of the party ought to avoid the capital as if it had the plague. They ought, with some few exceptions, to live in the country districts. The centralization of all activity in the city ought to be avoided. No excuse of administrative discipline should be taken as legitimizing the excrescence of a capital which is already overpopulated and overdeveloped with regard to 9/10 of the country. The party should be decentralized in the extreme. It is the only way to bring life to regions which are dead, those regions which are not yet awakened to life. In practice, there will be at least one member of political bureau in each area, and he will deliberately not be appointed as the head of that area. He will have no administrative powers. The regional member of the political bureau is not expected to hold the highest rank in the regional administrative organization. He ought not automatically to belong to the regional administrative body. For the people, the party is not an authority, but an organism through which they as the people exercise their authority and express their will. The less there is of confusion and duality of powers, the more the party will play its part of guide, and the more surely it will constitute for the people a decisive guarantee. If the party is mingled with the government, the fact of being a party militant means that you take the shortcut of gain to private ends. To hold a post in the government, step up the ladder, get promotion, and make a career for yourself. In an underdeveloped country, the setting up of dynamic district officials stops the process whereby the towns become top-heavy and the incoherent rush towards the cities of the mass country people. The setting up early in the days of independence of regional organizations and officials who have full authority to do everything in their power to awaken such a region, to bring life to it, and to hasten the growth of consciousness in it is a necessity from which there is no escape for a country that wishes to progress. Otherwise, the government bigwigs and the party officials group themselves around the leader. The government services swell to huge proportions, not because they are developing and specializing, but because new-found cousins and fresh militants are looking for jobs and hope to edge themselves into the government machine. And the dream of every citizen is to get up to the capital to have his share of the cake. The local districts are deserted. The mass of the country people, with no one to lead them, uneducated and unsupported, turn their backs on the poorly labored fields and flock toward the outer ring of the suburbs, thus swelling out of all proportion the ranks of the lumpen proletariat. The moment for a fresh national crisis is not far off. To avoid it, we think that a quite different policy should be followed, that the interior, the back country, ought to be the most privileged part of the country. Moreover, in last resort, there is nothing inconvenient in the government choosing its seat elsewhere than in the capital. The capital must be deconsecrated. The outcast masses must be shown that we have decided to work for them. It is with this idea in mind that the government of Brazil tried to found Brasilia. The dead city of Rio de Janeiro was an insult to the Brazilian people. But unfortunately, Brasilia is just another new capital, as monstrous as the first. The only advantage of this achievement is that today there exists no road through the bush to it. No, there is no serious reason which can be opposed to the choice of another capital, or to the moving of the government as a whole toward one of the most underpopulated regions. The capital of underdeveloped countries is a commercial notion inherited from the colonial period. But we are citizens of the underdeveloped countries. We ought to seek every occasion for contacts with the rural masses. We must create a national policy, in other words, a policy for the masses. We ought never to lose contact with the people which has battled for its independence and for the concrete betterment of its existence. The native civil servants and technicians ought not to bury themselves in diagrams and statistics, but rather in the hearts of the people. They ought not to bristle up every time there is a question of move to be made in the quote-unquote interior. We should no longer see the young women of the country threaten their husbands with divorce if they do not manage to avoid being appointed to a rural post. For these reasons, the political bureau of the party ought to treat these forgotten districts with a very privileged manner, and the life of the capital, an altogether artificial life which is stuck onto the real national life like a foreign body, ought to take up the least space possible in the life of the nation, which is sacred and fundamental. In an underdeveloped country, the party ought to be organized in such a fashion that it is not simply content with having contacts with the masses. The party should be the direct expression of the masses. The party is not an administration responsible for transmitting government orders. It is the energetic spokesman of the incorruptible defender of the masses. In order to arrive at this conception of the party, we must above all rid ourselves of the very Western, very bourgeois, and therefore contemptuous attitude that the masses are incapable of governing themselves. In fact, experience proves that the masses understand perfectly the most complicated problems. One of the greatest services that the Algerian Revolution will have rendered to the intellectuals of Algeria will be to have placed them in contact with the people, to have allowed them to see the extreme, ineffable poverty of the people. At the same time, allowing them to watch the awakening of the people's intelligence and the onward progress of their consciousness. The Algerian people, that mass of starving illiterates, those men and women plunged for centuries in the most appalling obscurity, have held out against tanks and airplanes, against napalm and quote-unquote psychological services, but above all against corruption and brainwashing, against traitors, and against the quote-unquote national armies of General Belugins. This people has held out in spite of hesitant or feeble individuals and in spite of would-be dictators. This people is held out because for 7 years its struggle has opened up for its vistas that it has never dreamed existed. Today, arms factories are working in midst of the mountains several yards underground. Today, the people's tribunals are functioning at every level, and local planning commissions are organizing the division of large-scale holdings and working out the Algeria of tomorrow. An isolated individual may obstinately refuse to understand a problem, but the group or the village understands with disconcerting rapidity. It is true that if care is taken to use only a language that it is understood by graduates in law and economics, you can easily prove that the masses have to be managed from above. But if you speak the language of every day, if you are not obsessed by the perverse desire to spread confusion and to rid yourself of the people, then you will realize that the masses are quick to seize every shade of meaning and to learn all the tricks of the trade. If recourse is had to technical language, this signifies that it has been decided to consider the masses as uninitiated. Such a language is hard to put it to hide the lecturer's wish to cheat the people and to leave them out of things. The business of obscuring language is a mask behind which stands out the much greater business of plunder. The people's prosperity and the people's sovereignty are to be stripped from them at one and the same time. Everything can be explained to the people on a single condition, that you really want them to understand, and if you think that you don't need them, and that, on the contrary, they may hinder the smooth running of the many limited liability companies whose aim it is to make the people even poorer, then the problem is quite clear. And that's where I'll leave off for part 2, and then next will be part 3 and the last part of chapter 3. Thanks.